This is FRM Part 1, Book 3, Financial Markets and Products, and the chapter on futures markets. We spent some good time in Chapter 4 on the introduction to derivative securities, talking about futures contracts. And a couple of important things to remember, which will show up in these first couple of slides, is that a futures contract is really nothing more than a standardized forward contract that is characterized by daily settlement. Let's go ahead and look right at the learning objectives. We're going to look at the key features of a futures contract. We'll talk about convergence of futures and spot prices. This is really a cool concept. We'll do some margin discussions, kind of piggybacking on what we did back in Chapter 4. Talk about the clearinghouse and other central counterparties. Collateralization in the over-the-counter market, talking about a normal and inverted futures market. We're going to call those things contango and backwardation. Talk a little bit about the delivery process and some order types, and then compare and contrast forward and futures contracts. And I gave you that really good contrasting back in that first slide. Let's start with the key features of a futures contract. Notice what I have in that very first block point. Futures contract is a standardized exchange tradable obligation. So we're actually signing a contract. I promise to buy or I promise to sell some underlying good. It could be some gold, it could be some oil, it could be the S&P 500 index, or it could be lumber. I mean, any number of these commodities or financial futures underlying assets will have futures contracts written on them. And this will be done at a specified price and on a specified date. So let's go ahead and list the key features here. So they're exchange tradable. They are standardized. So the terms are standardized, meaning the amount is standardized and the maturity date is standardized. And notice I have in the bold letters there, this is for increased liquidity. There's no doubt that the standardization of forward contracts makes futures contracts highly marketable and highly liquid. In fact, the market is so liquid that whenever an individual or an institution wants to get out of their contract, so to speak, and I'll talk about how that's done in a later slide, there's somebody willing to come in and step in and take the place. Another key feature is the marking to market. So there is a winner and a loser declared at the end of the day, and the losing individual or entity has to pay the winning individual or entity over time. And we do this on a daily basis so that the losses tend to be more palatable and manageable. I mean, let's just think about it. If you waited 3 or 6 or 12 months in order to settle, and think about the price of gold and the price of oil and interest rates over time, I mean, these underlying assets can change positions dramatically over a 6-month time period. And so at the end of 6 months, some party might be looking at a $5 or $10 or $100 million obligation. And that, of course, increases the liquidity because what you're doing is you're taking these losses over a much shorter time periods. And then we did talk about margins. There's an initial margin in which both the long and the short position must put up when the initial trade is executed. Because remember, in a futures contract, 2 people are agreeing to trade at some time in the future. There's no capital changing hands today. But both parties have to put up a margin. And remember, that margin is that's their own capital. That's not like paying the premium to the option writer. And then there's a maintenance margin. If the value of the contract falls below that maintenance margin, then the short or long position will receive a margin call. There's also a clearinghouse that acts, kind of as an intermediary. The clearinghouse writes a separate contract with the long position and the short position. What this does is substantially reduces credit risk. Essentially, the clearinghouse, kind of acts as the opposite side. So if we take the long position in a corn futures contract, then the clearinghouse will take the short position. And then they'll find a short position out in the market, and then they'll take the long position in there. Of course, there's no direct contact between the short and long parties. I mean, that makes no sense because they can communicate with the clearinghouse. And it's important to remember that the clearinghouse is going to make those margin calls. Now, another key feature is that you can't show up on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and say something like, you know what, I want to take the short position in 1 million orange juice futures contracts. So there are position limits, and this has almost everything to do with trying to reduce the role of speculators and perhaps their influence in market prices. Typically, we don't say we're going to buy corn in the futures market or sell corn in the futures market. We use the terminology long and short position. So the long position agrees to buy the underlying asset at the maturity date of the contract. The short position agrees to sell the underlying asset at the maturity date of the contract. So the long position benefits when prices rise. The short position benefits when prices fall. And so you would never take the long position if you expected a stock market crash. A long position in an S&P 500 index futures contract. There's no way you would do that. If you thought the S&P 500 index was going to rise, you'd take the long position in this contract. Wouldn't cost you anything today. And then if there is a big spike in the S&P 500 index itself, then in the derivatives market, in the futures market, then you would realize that gain. And of course, you do it every day because of the daily settlement. Now, let's take a look at how these futures margin requirements work. Let's suppose we have an investor who takes the long position in a gold futures contract at $300. Standard amount of the contract is 100 troy ounces. I always ask my students, what's the difference between a troy ounce and a regular ounce? Nobody seems to know this. And I forget it over time. Somehow a troy ounce goes back to the Roman Empire, and it was some different way of measuring stuff, whatever they measured all that time ago. And so I think, what is a regular ounce adds up to 1 pound. 16 ounces is 1 pound. I think it's 14.5 or 14.6 troy ounces. That really doesn't add any value to what we're studying here. So forget about that last 30 seconds of the video. Let's suppose the initial margin is 5,000 and the maintenance margin is 3,000. So as the long position, we have to put up $5,000 today. Now, of course, the short position, wherever this person is located, will have to put up $5,000 as the short position. And so the clearinghouse can see that both positions have $5,000. All right, so we're in the long position. We're betting that the price of gold rises. But let's suppose that at the end of day one, the price falls to $290. This is not good news for us. So what did we lose? We lost the 300 minus the 290, which is $10 times the 100 troy ounces. That gives us 1,000. Or you can just do it in the aggregate way. We had a contract that was initially valued at 30,000. Now it's only valued at 29,000. So we lost 1,000. That means that we have 5,000 in our initial margin. And now our ending balance in our margin account is now $4,000. So we lost $1,000. Now that $1,000 will be taken by the clearinghouse and will magically appear over in the short positions account. So the short position will now have $6,000 in his or her account. And that short position can do whatever he or she wants to do with that $1,000. There'll be no margin call since it's above the maintenance margin of $3,000. But let's suppose on day two, price continues to fall down to $278 per troy ounce. We suffer a loss of $12 times 100, so that's $1,200. Or we can do it the aggregate way, take the 29,000, which was the ending position the day before, minus the 27,800. That gets us to 1,200. So we lose $1,200 that second day. Now our margin account only has $2,800 in it. So we're definitely going to get a margin call. So we've got to deposit $2,200 to get back up to that $5,000 so that we can trade, of course, during the next day. Now we'll talk about this in a later slide. You don't have to continue suffering these losses like day one and day two and day three and day four. If you continue to lose, you can just say, you know what, I'm out. I'm tired of losing. And so you can take an offsetting position and you can get out of that contract. Convergence. I love having this conversation. All right, so the spot price is the current market price for immediate delivery. The futures price, of course, is the price for delivery at some time in the future. And the difference between those two is called the basis. There's a nice equation in blue in the middle of the slide deck. Remember, the basis is the spot price minus the futures price. Now, here's the thing. Let's suppose that we have spot price of corn. Let's say it's $3, and the futures price of corn is, let's say, $3.25. Now, what we're doing is we are agreeing to trade today at $3, right? That's the spot market. And if we want to trade in the future, we're agreeing to trade at $3.25. So that difference is known as the basis. But what happens over time? The reason that there was a 25-cent difference between those two prices was because there are lots of costs associated with holding that particular underlying asset. But what happens over time is that a 6-month contract becomes a 3-month contract. And then it becomes a 2-month and a 1-month contract. And then a 1-week contract. So think about this. As we get closer and closer to the maturity date of the contract, what used to be a 6-month contract, and the difference in those two prices was 25 cents, now is only a 1-week contract. And so the difference is going to be much less. And then when it becomes a 3-day contract and a 2-day contract and a 1-day contract. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about the timing of this. Let's suppose that there's 1 minute left on this futures contract. 1 minute until it matures. Well, in this case, the spot market and the futures market are essentially the same market. It's for the delivery of the underlying asset immediately. And does 1 minute sound immediately? Well, if you don't think 1 minute sounds immediately, then go to 30 seconds or to 20 seconds or 15 seconds. But the point is that on the maturity date of the contract, the two markets become the same market. They become identical. So therefore, look at the final block point there. At maturity, these two prices have to converge. Now, they might be falling over time or they might be rising over time, but nevertheless, those two prices are going to be the same price. And remember, it's because the two markets become identical. How about collateralization in the over-the-counter markets? Think of it this way. OTC markets, they tend to have more credit risks. And what that means then is there's going to be some higher level of default on these payments. And so one way to handle this extra credit risk is through the process of collateralization. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take a set of assets, a set of financial securities or cash, and they're going to be given as security by both parties in a contract to hedge against this credit risk. So what happens is that you can use, notice I got some circle points there. You can use AAA rated bonds, you can use US Treasury bonds, and you can use that as part of your margin. So this is the collateralization. And so what happens though, if one party loses, then the other party can just take ownership of those securities. So notice that final block point. To avoid complications, collateral securities that are near maturity are those within anticipated coupon dates during the lifetime of that futures contract are probably not going to be used. I mean, can you imagine two people fighting over the coupon payment? Well, that's my coupon payment. No, that's my coupon payment. So that's why, the most commonly used security is a US Treasury bill. All right, so this is what I said just in that previous slide. Any loss is settled using the collateral at the end of the day. And let's face it, I mean, do you really care if at the end of the day, if you're the long position and prices have risen and you won, let's say you won $5,000, the value of your contract is increased by $5,000. Do you really care if you get $5,000 in cash or $5,000 in treasury bills? Because you can easily tell your broker to sell those treasury bills almost immediately. Here we go. I mentioned these two concepts of contango and backwardation in that first slide when we were talking about the objectives. All right, let's consider a couple of possibilities here. Look at that first circle point. Let's suppose that the price of a barrel of oil today is $50. So there's the spot price. So if I'm an oil man, I'm digging the oil out of the ground and I have a barrel of oil and I'm willing to sell it today for $50. But on the floor of a mercantile exchange or in the over-the-counter market, I might be willing to sell it for $53. You might come to me and say, you know what, Jim, I don't need your oil today, but I need it in 3 months. And I'm going to say, okay, well, clearly I'm not going to sell it to you for $50. What makes sense then is for you to help me pay for my storage costs, right? I have this barrel of oil. I have to put it over there, and I have to put it somewhere where I can keep it safe, right? I might need to air condition it. I might need to put some heating in there. I have to buy some insurance. I have to pay for all sorts of stuff. So I am going to ask you to pay for that storage. And so I'll sell it to you in 3 months for $53. We call this a market that is in contango, in which the futures price is above the spot price. Now, are you ready for this? What that implies for the curve, it means that since the futures price is above the spot price and they're going to converge, that means that the futures price will tend to fall. And that's the red line down there, the contango. Notice on the horizontal axis we have time, and then the futures price is on the vertical axis. So under contango, that futures price tends to fall. It's a little bit more complicated than just that graph there, but that's an easy way to remember it. Now, on the other hand, suppose that the spot price is $50 and you come to me and say, hey, Jim, I want to buy this barrel of oil from you in 3 months. And I get out my calculations and I say, okay, how about $45? And you think, whoa, that sounds like a great idea. If I have to buy the oil today for $50, I have to pay you $50, and then I have to pay to store it for 3 months because I don't need it for 3 months. If you're only going to charge me $45 in 3 months, oh my gosh, that sounds like a great deal to me. So isn't that kind of a backward kind of thinking? So that's why we call this an inversion or backwardation. And backwardation, especially in the commodities markets, tends to occur very, very infrequently, but it occurs after periods of demand or supply shocks or expectations of shocks. I mean, let's suppose that today there is a shortage of oil for whatever reason. And so in the spot market, the price is bid up to 50. But somebody just announced that they have just dug for oil over there in Alaska or someplace, and they've hit, 10 billion barrels, and that's all going to be able to be extracted in 3 months. So we're expecting the price to fall in 3 month time period. That's why if that futures price is less, $45 versus $50, that's why the green, normal backwardation, that's why that price is going to tend to rise. Now, I promised you earlier I'd tell you how to get out of this futures contract, and you can do it a couple of different ways. You can just show up with the goods, right? The short position agrees to sell, so the short position can just fulfill the terms of the contract by bringing the corn or the oil or the gold right to the buyer. But you can close this out at any time, and so a closeout is a scenario under which the futures trader just closes it out, either today or tomorrow or any time before the maturity date of the contract. And so essentially what you do is if you have the long position, you just pick up the phone and call the clearinghouse or your broker and say, hey, I want an equivalent long-term position. And what those things do is cancel each other. Of course, we can hold on to these things and cash settle at the end of every day. And then on the final day, we'll have the final marking to market. So that's cash settlement. And you might remember what I said back in chapter 4. It's about 98, 99% of all derivatives contracts are settled in cash because nobody really wants to own or sell the underlying asset. And it's way more complex to do it inside of the futures market than it is just to take your cash out of the futures market and then go do whatever you have to do in the spot market. And then you can exchange for physical. You can find another trader who has the opposite position and then kind of, it's almost like a bartering system. Different types of orders. These are virtually identical to what you probably know from the stock market. There's the market order, there's a limit order, and there's a stop loss order. As you go down as you go down the page there on the slide, these get a little bit more complex. But those limit orders and the stop loss orders and all these other different types of orders, they're generally designed so that you can kind of lock in a price or minimize losses or maybe maximize gains or lock in a portion of the gain. And that takes us through Chapter 5. We'll continue our discussion on futures markets with some hedging conversations.